She was 21 and newly landless, with no father to speak for her and no dowry to soften the shame, just a tin box of her mother's sewing needles and £4 and 11 shillings tied into the corner of a handkerchief. And with that handkerchief pressed into her palm, she rode north to Rookstone to take possession of a flooded quarry that no contractor in the county would touch. A wet, sunken scar of a place that the Duke's steward had signed over to her in place of the pension her father had been promised. But what nobody knew, not the steward who laughed into his ledger, not the masons who called it a duck pond, not even Helen Fletcher herself as she stood on its muddy lip that first gray morning, was that beneath the black water and the ruined spoil lay a broad, unbroken seam of sound local stone, patient as a sleeping animal, waiting for someone stubborn enough to drain it. So settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, because this is a story about what happens when a gift meant as a mockery is taken up in earnest and worked and made to answer. Helen Fletcher had been born in the low stone cottage at the edge of Ellerby Parish in the spring of 1829, the only surviving child of Thomas Fletcher, land agent to a minor branch of the ducal family, and of Margaret Fletcher, born Margaret Hoyle, who had been a lady's seamstress before her marriage, and who kept her needles in a japanned tin box lined with faded green baize. Her mother died of a lung fever when Helen was 9, and her father, who had been a careful, quiet man before that winter, became a more careful and more quiet man after it, teaching his daughter to read a survey map and a rent roll at the kitchen table as if these were the natural inheritance of a girl her age. He walked her out along the boundaries of the estate on Sunday afternoons, naming the fields and the coppices and the old marl pits and the disused workings, showing her how to read the lie of a hillside, how to tell good stone from bad by the ring it made under a hammer, how to see where water would run and where it would stand. He was not a mason and he was not a quarryman, but he had walked over the Duke's ground for 30 years, and he had listened to the men who cut it, and he passed on to Helen what he had gathered as though he suspected, in some dim way, that she would need it. The formative figure of her girlhood, though, and the one whose voice she still heard in her head at difficult moments, was old Mrs. Ainsley, the cottage housekeeper, a widow of 68 who had come to keep Thomas Fletcher's house after Margaret's death, and who had stayed on for 11 years without ever raising her voice. Mrs. Ainsley had grown up the daughter of a stone-getter in the Pennine Dales, and she knew the trade in the practical, second-hand way of women who had washed the shirts and packed the dinners of men who worked with rock. She taught Helen how to keep an account book, how to reckon a load by the cart, how to speak civilly to laborers without giving ground, and how to make a mutton stew stretch to feed 6 men if 6 men came unexpected to the door. She taught her, too, that a woman who wished to be respected must know the price of everything she bought and the weight of everything she carried, and Helen, who was a serious child, wrote these things down in a little marbled notebook she kept in the drawer beside her bed. When Thomas Fletcher died in the autumn of 1849, worn out by a bad chest and a longer sorrow, he left his daughter no land and no money to speak of, only the freehold of the cottage, the japanned tin box that had been her mother's, a small shelf of survey books, and the verbal promise made to him by the old Duke over many years that a modest pension would descend to Helen should anything befall him. The old Duke, however, had himself died the previous spring, and the promise had never been set down on paper, and the young Duke who succeeded him was a thin, pleasant, distracted man of 34 who signed whatever his steward put before him, and who had never in his life heard Helen Fletcher's name spoken aloud. Mrs. Ainsley, who was by then 79 and much bent, sat with Helen in the kitchen the night after the funeral and said only, "You have a good head, child, and you have your mother's hands. Do not let them take those from you as well." Then she pressed into Helen's palm the tin box of needles, though it had been Helen's already for years, as if to seal a promise between the living and the dead, and she went up to her room and slept until morning. Helen sat by the banked fire until the coals had gone gray, and she opened the box, and she counted the needles as her mother had taught her to count them, and she did not cry. The letter from the Duke's steward arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, carried up the lane by a boy from the coaching inn who had been paid a penny to deliver it, and who did not wait for a reply. It was a single sheet folded thrice, sealed in red wax bearing the ducal crest, addressed in a clerkly hand to Miss H. Fletcher, Ellerby Cottage. Helen read it standing in the doorway with the cold coming in around her skirts, and she read it a second time sitting at the kitchen table, and she read it a third time in the afternoon by the window, to be certain she had understood. The letter was courteous. It regretted the recent bereavement. It observed that no formal instrument existed by which any pension or annuity had been settled upon the late Mr. Fletcher's dependents, and that the present Duke, though sensible of long service, was not in a position to honor an undertaking for which no record could be produced. It went on to say that in consideration of Mr. Fletcher's 30 years upon the estate, His Grace had been pleased to convey to Miss Fletcher, in full and final settlement of any claim, the freehold of a small parcel of ground known locally as the Rookstone Quarry, together with such spoil, workings, tools, and buildings as remained upon it. A rough plan was enclosed, drawn in brown ink, showing an irregular oval of some 4 acres marked Water across its middle in the steward's own hand. The letter closed with the steward's compliments, and the observation that the deed would be lodged at the Rookstone attorney's office, and might be collected at Miss Fletcher's convenience. Helen folded the letter along its old creases, and put it into the drawer beside the marbled notebook. She did not go to Mrs. Ainsley with it that evening, because Mrs. Ainsley had taken to her bed with a cough that would carry her off before Christmas, and there was no purpose in laying a fresh weight upon a woman already carrying her last. She went instead to the shelf of survey books, and she found the volume marked North Riding, and she turned the pages until she found the parish of Rookstone, and she read what her father had written in his small neat pencil beside the entry for the quarry: Soundstone at depth, workings abandoned 1836, water not managed. She read the line twice. Then she closed the book and set it on the table and put the kettle on the fire. In the days that followed, she settled what could be settled. She paid the undertaker 18 shillings and sixpence. She paid the parish clerk 2 shillings for the burial fee. She sold her father's second-best coat and his good boots to a peddler for 7 shillings, and she sold the pony and trap to the miller at Ellerby for £4.10, and she gave £1 of that to Mrs. Ainsley's niece against the nursing that would be needed. She kept the cottage in her own name and let it for 1 shilling a week to a young curate and his wife who wanted a first house. She packed her mother's tin box, 3 plain dresses, a shawl, a stout pair of walking boots, her father's survey books tied with twine, the marbled notebook, an oilcloth cape, and a small clasp knife into a single leather trunk. She tied £4 and 11 shillings into the corner of a linen handkerchief and pinned the handkerchief to the inside of her bodice. She went once more up the stairs to sit beside Mrs. Ainsley, who was sleeping, and she put her hand on the old woman's hand for a long time, and then she came down and closed the door behind her. She left Ellerby at first light on the 22nd of November, in a grey drizzle that would neither commit to rain nor lift. The carrier's cart took her as far as Thirsk for 1 and 3pence, jolting over ruts that had already begun to freeze at their edges, with a heap of turnips beside her and a farmer's wife opposite who slept most of the way with her mouth open. Helen sat with her trunk between her boots and watched the country she had known all her life go by in its winter colors. The bare hedgerows twisted with old man's beard, the ploughed fields going dark under the wet, the rooks lifting off stubble in slow black handfuls, the dry stone walls running away over the hills like stitching in a coarse cloth. She named the fields to herself as she passed them because her father had named them for her, and it seemed important that someone still remember the names. At Thirsk she took a place on the mail coach as far as Northallerton for 2 and 6pence, riding outside because it was cheaper by half, and she pulled the oilcloth cape close and tied her bonnet strings under her chin and let the wind take what it would. The country grew steeper as they went north. The hedgerows thinned, the walls thickened, and the stone in those walls changed color under her eye, going from the warm honey of the low country to a paler, harder gray that rang differently, she thought, when a hoof struck a loose topstone. She was noting this without meaning to, in the way her father had taught her, and she was tired enough that the noting felt like company. She slept that night at a coaching inn outside Northallerton for 10 pence, and a shared bed with a Methodist woman who prayed under her breath until midnight, and she rose at 4 in the dark and walked the last 7 miles to Rookstone, with her trunk carried by a lad from the inn for 3 pence and a slice of bread. The lane climbed steadily out of the town and along a beck that ran the color of weak tea, past 3 farms with lamps still lit in their byres, past a Wesleyan chapel with its door padlocked, past a stand of larches that had been felled and not yet carted away. The drizzle stopped as they climbed, and a white mist came up out of the ground instead, and Helen walked in it with her boots darkening at the toes and her breath making its own small weather in front of her. Rookstone itself was not much, a single street of low gray cottages, a public house called the Blue Bell, with a swinging sign that needed paint, a smithy already ringing at that hour, a squat church with a saddleback tower, and above the village on the western slope the pale scar of the quarry, visible from the street as a broken line in the hillside, where the turf had been peeled back and never grown over. The lad set her trunk down at the door of the Blue Bell and touched his cap and took his 3 pence and his bread and went back down the hill whistling, and Helen stood in the street with the mist rising around her boots and looked up at the scar on the hill, and she thought, without any particular feeling attached to the thought, that she had come to the place where the rest of her life would happen. She took a room at the Blue Bell for 9 pence a night, ate a plate of bread and cold bacon in the parlor for 2 pence more, and by 9 o'clock she was at the door of the Rookstone attorney, a Mr. Peel, whose office was 2 low rooms above the saddler's shop. Mr. Peel was a thin man of about 50 in a rusty black coat, and he had the deed already made up on his table because the steward's clerk had ridden over with it the previous week. He read the description of the property aloud in a flat voice: 4 acres, 2 roods, and 11 perches of ground, known as the Rookstone Quarry, together with all workings, spoil heaps, tools, huts, tramways, and appurtenances thereon, bounded on the north by the parish road, on the east by pasture belonging to one Josiah Marmont, on the south by the beck, and on the west by rough moor. And then he laid the paper flat and dipped a pen and offered it to her. Helen paid the fee of £1 6 for the enrollment and the copy, signed her name in a clean, upright hand, and took the folded parchment from him, wrapped in a square of blue paper. Mr. Peel looked at her over his spectacles when she was at the door and said, not unkindly, that he hoped she had not paid too much for what she had bought, and Helen said she had paid nothing for it, and he said, "That is likely still too much," and returned to his ledger. She walked up to the quarry alone that morning by a rutted cart track that climbed between 2 dry stone walls. At the top, the track bent through a gap and opened onto the ground itself, and Helen stopped inside the gap and looked. The quarry lay in a rough oval, perhaps 140 yards long and 80 across, cut down into the hillside on 3 sides in benches of stone that stepped raggedly toward the center, with the 4th side, the western, opening onto the moor by a broken slope of spoil. In the middle of it, filling perhaps 2/3 of the floor, was the water, black and quite still, with a skin of yellow leaves on its surface, and the reflected sky broken across it in dulled patches. The benches around the water were of a pale, honey-colored limestone streaked in places with rust and lichen, and the top 4 or 5 feet had gone soft and crumbly with weather. But below that, the rock stood in clean, sheer courses where the last cutters had left off in 1836. A wooden crane leaned drunkenly at the north lip with its jib rotted through and its chain fallen into the water. 2 stone huts stood off to one side, roofless, their walls sound to the eaves. A rusted iron tramway ran from the huts to the edge of the drop and stopped there in mid-air where the last section of track had fallen away. A stack of squared blocks lay to the east, mossed over and half sunk into the turf, perhaps 40 tons of good stone that no one had ever come back to cart out. Helen walked the whole boundary of it slowly, in her stout boots, with the deed still folded in her hand. She counted the benches on the north face and made 3 of them, each about 10 feet deep, and she saw where the water lay against the lowest one at a level that told her the pit had filled from the beck and from a spring somewhere in the west wall and had never been drained because no one had thought it worth the trouble. She pressed her boot against a fallen block at the edge, and it did not give. She knelt and rapped it with the handle of her clasp knife, and the note came back clean and hard, not the dull thud of frost-cracked rubble, but the bell ring of stone that had lain sound in the ground for 100,000 years. She rose slowly and stood with her hand at her mouth, and then she took it away and went on walking the boundary as if nothing had happened. She spent the rest of that day in the huts. The larger of the two was 15 feet by 12, built of the same honeystone in courses 2 feet thick, with a stone-flagged floor still level under a layer of leaf mold and rat droppings, and a plain iron grate set into the end wall for a fire. The lintel over the door was cracked, but had not dropped. She swept it out with a birch broom she cut from the hedge, laid her oilcloth cape on the floor by the grate, and sat down on her trunk to eat a heel of bread and a piece of cheese she had brought up from the inn. The wind moved in the roofless walls above her and dropped a slate onto the flagstones, and she flinched but did not rise, and she thought that a roof was a thing that could be put back, and that she had 4 pounds 10 shillings and a deed and a pit full of water and a seam of stone under the water and a set of huts sound to the eaves, and that she would start with the smaller hut. The smaller hut, when she came to it in the last hour of light, was 10 feet by 9 and stood on a slight rise at the back of the workings, and it was in worse condition than the first. Half its roof timbers had gone, and a young rowan had grown up through the gap and was now higher than the wall. She meant only to look inside and see whether the floor was worth having, and she pushed the door with her shoulder, and the door, which had not been opened in 14 years, resisted a moment and then gave, dragging a small pile of leaves across the flagstones. Inside the light was gray and thin. There was a rough wooden bench along one wall, a coil of tarred rope, a rusted crowbar, and, in the corner farthest from the door, a low chest of dark oak bound in iron, no more than 2 feet long by 14 inches deep, standing on the floor with a slab of loose flagstone dragged partly over its lid as though someone had meant it to look like nothing. Helen stood with her hand on the doorframe a long moment. Then she went in and moved the flag aside with her boot and knelt and lifted the lid, which was not locked, only stiff with damp. And inside the chest, laid on a folded piece of oiled canvas, she saw first a leather pouch drawn tight with a cord, and beside it a small tin candle box, and beneath both a single folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, addressed on its outside in a careful old-fashioned hand to "Whoever finds this and has need of it." She sat back on her heels in the dim hut and looked at it for a long time before she touched anything, because she understood without being told that she had come to the pivot of her life, and she wanted to remember the exact quality of the light and the smell of the leaves and the ache in her knees when she remembered it later. She lifted the pouch first because a woman raised by Mrs. Ainsley counted what was to be counted before she read what was to be read, and she loosened the cord and turned the mouth of it into her palm, and out slid, one by one, and heavy for their size, gold sovereigns of the old king's reign, milled and bright, where the leather had kept them clean. She counted them onto the flag beside her knee in small stacks of 5. There were 42 of them, and beneath them in the bottom of the pouch, tied in a scrap of red thread, 3 half-sovereigns and a folded 5-pound note of the York Union Bank. She sat with her hand flat over the little stacks and did not breathe for a moment, and then she breathed, and then she opened the tin candle box and found in it a plain silver thimble, worn thin at the rim, and a small brass rule marked in inches for a stonecutter's work, and a lock of pale hair tied with a black ribbon. Then, and only then, she unfolded the paper and turned it toward what light there was, and read. By the time Helen came down from the quarry that evening, the letter was folded again inside her bodice with the handkerchief of shillings, and the pouch of sovereigns was under the loose flagstone in the small hut with the crowbar laid across it, and she had already worked out in her head the order of the first 6 weeks. She wrote it that night in the marbled notebook by candle in the Bluebell parlor, in Mrs. Ainsley's columns: drain, roof, road, tools, hands, stone. She underlined drain twice. The next morning she walked to the smithy at the bottom of the street and asked for John Ridley, blacksmith, 52, a stout man with a burn scar down the back of one wrist, who had shod horses in Rookstone for 30 years and remembered the quarry when it worked. She asked him what it would cost to have a hand pump built to lift water from the pit into the beck, and he pulled his lip and said £7 for the ironwork if she found the timber, and she said she would find the timber, and he said he could have it ready in 3 weeks. She paid him £2 down out of the sovereigns changed at Mr. Peel's into pounds and shillings so that no one in Rookstone should see gold pass in the street. For the timber she went to Josiah Marmont, whose pasture lay east of the quarry, a farmer of 60 with a face like a russet apple, who had for 14 years grazed his sheep to the very lip of the pit and thought of it as a nuisance. She offered him 30 shillings for the fallen larches at the head of his top field and the loan of his cart for a week, and he agreed because 30 shillings was 30 shillings, and because he had decided within an hour of her arrival that the young woman meant to work. For labor she went first to William Hebden, 41, a mason out of work since the parish church tower had been finished in the spring, who lived in the last cottage of the row, with a wife and 4 children, and had been eating turnips for a fortnight. She offered him 2 shillings a day and his dinner, and told him plainly what she had and what she meant to do, and showed him the note in her father's hand on the page marked Rookstone. He read it twice and said, "Sound stone at depth. I always thought so." He came the next morning with his mallet, 2 chisels, a plumb bob, and his eldest boy Robert, 13, to fetch and carry for 6pence a day. They began by clearing the yard. They pulled the rowan out of the small hut with a rope round the trunk, and Marmont's cart horse leaning into the collar. They stripped the rotted timbers from the crane, and laid new oak beams that Hebden squared with an adze on the flagged floor, while Helen measured with the brass rule from the tin box. They dragged the coil of tarred rope out into the sun, and beat the moss out of it. They mended the door of the larger hut with planks split from a larch butt, and hung it on new strap hinges from Ridley's forge. Helen slept in that hut from the 3rd night, on a straw pallet by the iron grate, with her tin box under the pallet and the deed rolled inside her father's survey book. On the 8th day, the pump came up the cart track in 3 pieces on Marmont's wagon, and Ridley walked behind it in his Sunday coat as though escorting a bride. They set it on a bed of squared stone at the north lip with a timber jib to work the handle in relays, and by dinner time it was drawing. The water went down an inch on the first day and 3 inches on the second, because the spring in the west wall kept feeding, and by the end of the 3rd week they had bared the top bench for a length of 40 feet, and Hebden had cut his first sound block out of it, 4 foot by 2 by 18 inches, and rung it with his hammer, and stood back and taken off his cap. Word of the ring of that hammer went down the hill before the block did. Within the fortnight, Helen had 5 men on the ground, Hebden and his boy, Thomas Beale, 36, a carter with 2 horses and a stone dray, who agreed to 7 shillings a load to Ainderby and beyond; Matthew Turnbull, 29, a former slate-getter from Swaledale, who knew how to work a bench with wedges and feathers; and old Peter Ray, 67, who had cut in Rookstone Quarry as a lad in the 20s, and came up one morning with his own iron bar over his shoulder, and asked for a day's work at whatever she thought right. She gave him 1 and 8pence and his dinner, and set him to sound the west face where his memory said the seam ran deepest, and he was proved correct within an hour. The first order came from the Reverend Mr. Ashby, 61, vicar of Rookstone, who wanted 12 yards of coping for the churchyard wall at 9pence the yard cut and dressed, and paid in coin on delivery. The second came from the squire at Nethergill, who wanted a load of dressed stone for a stable gable, and paid £3.15. The third and fourth came in the same week from farmers wanting gateposts and lintels, and by the middle of March, Helen had banked £22 at the York Union at Northallerton in her own name, over and above what she had laid out on wages and tools and the loan of Marmont's cart, which she now paid regularly at 1 shilling the day. She kept the accounts herself in a plain calf ledger bought at Mr. Peel's for 4 shillings, ruled in Mrs. Ainsley's columns for date, buyer, load, price paid, price outstanding, and remarks. She wrote in a small, clear hand at the huts by candle each evening, and she paid on Saturdays at noon in the yard, and no man ever left her ground short of what had been agreed, and every man knew it by the end of the first quarter. By May, the water was down to the second bench, and Hebden was cutting on 2 faces. By June the crane was working again with a new chain forged by Ridley and a windlass turned by Robert Hebden and another boy from the smithy, and the mossed stack of 40 tons of old squared blocks had been sold entire to a builder from Bedale for £110 delivered. By July, Helen was quarrymaster of the Rookstone Works in fact, if not in title, and the men called her Miss Fletcher without irony when they spoke of her, and ma'am when they spoke to her. She took a small back room at the Blue Bell, in addition to the hut, at 3 shillings a week, for the keeping of the ledger and the receiving of buyers, and Mrs. Sowerby, 48, the landlady, brought her tea at 4 in a brown earthenware pot without being asked, and would take no coin for it. On market days, Helen walked down into Rookstone with the ledger under her arm and paid her men and settled her accounts at the counter of the Bluebell parlor, and the farmers in from the moor touched their hats to her as she passed the door of the smithy, and John Ridley's wife Sarah, 49, gave her a pot of blackberry jam at Michaelmas because, she said, a body could not live on bread and cold bacon forever. A rhythm formed around the quarry that had not been there in 14 years, and the parish began to arrange itself around it as parishes will. The Carter Beal came up the track at first light on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and went down loaded with dressed stone for Ainderby, Bedale, Thirsk, and once as far as Ripon, where a canon of the cathedral had ordered 8 yards of paving for a cloister walk. Peter Ray was fetched to the huts each morning by his grandson and sat on a stool in the sun, sounding blocks for flaws, when his legs would not carry him further, and Helen paid him 1 and 8 every day, whether he sounded 10 blocks or 100, and no one on the ground begrudged him a farthing of it. Reverend Mr. Ashby fell into the habit of walking up to the workings on a Thursday afternoon, with his stick and his terrier, sitting on a squared block by the crane, and taking a cup of tea from the tin kettle over Helen's grate, and speaking of the churchyard wall and of his sister in Durham and of nothing in particular. He was the first person in Rookstone to say aloud that Miss Fletcher of the quarry had done more for the parish in 6 months than the young Duke had done in 6 years, and though he said it quietly to his terrier, Mrs. Sowerby heard him and repeated it at the Bluebell that evening, and by Sunday it had been repeated in 3 farmhouses on the moor. Helen took on 2 more men in August, Edward Kilburn, 24, who had been a laborer on the Great North Road and could handle a horse and a barrow and a set of wedges with equal steadiness, and a lad called Michael Pratt, 15, whose mother was a widow at the far end of the village and who came up the track one morning in a coat too big for him and asked for work. She set Pratt to the water pump at 4p a day and his dinner, and within a fortnight he was moved to the tramway, which Turnbull had relaid in fresh iron along the north face. The huts changed as the summer went. The larger hut, where Helen slept and kept the ledger, gained a proper window with leaded glass, ordered from North Allerton for £1 2 shillings, a plain iron bedstead bought at the sale of a farmer's effects in Bedale for 15 shillings, a deal table, 2 rush-bottomed chairs, and a shelf on which stood her father's survey books, tied no longer with twine, but ranged upright between 2 squared offcuts of Rookstone stone. The tin box of her mother's needles sat on the table beside the ledger, and beside the tin box sat the small brass rule marked in inches, which she used every day and set down every evening in the same place. On the first Saturday of every month, after wages were paid, Hebden's wife Hannah, 39, came up the track with a covered basket and a clean cloth and set out on the deal table a mutton pie, a loaf, a pat of butter, and a jug of small beer, and the men ate at the table in relays with their caps on their knees, and Helen sat at the head and served, because Mrs. Ainsley had taught her that a woman who wished to be respected must feed the men who worked for her before she fed herself. It was not spoken of as a ceremony, but by Christmas it was one, and the men shaved on Saturday mornings for it. News of the quarry traveled that autumn beyond the parish. A steward from a manor at Snape sent a boy on a pony to ask after prices for wallstone. A church restoration committee at Well wrote a letter on headed paper, asking for a quotation on 200 yards of dressed ashlar. A gentleman building a lodge above Masham rode over one Wednesday, walked the ground with Helen for an hour, ordered 30 tons on the spot, and paid a deposit of £10 in gold on the hut's table with the ledger open between them. Helen wrote his name and the sum and the delivery date in her small clear hand while he counted out the coins, and he watched her write and said, "You keep a book like a bank clerk, Miss Fletcher," and she said, "I was taught to," and closed the ledger. The Duke's steward heard of the workings in November, a year to the week after he had signed the deed, and rode over from the great house on a wet afternoon to see for himself. He came up the cart track on a grey mare with mud to her hocks and found the pump beating steadily, and Beale's dray loading at the crane and Hebden cutting on the third bench, and Helen at the door of the larger hut in a grey wool dress with an apron over it and the ledger open on the sill. He touched his hat and said he had not expected to find so much doing. Helen said she had not expected to find so much stone. He asked after the water. She said the water was managed. He stood a while longer in the yard, looked once at the mossed stump where the rowan had been, said he wished her well, and rode back down the hill without dismounting. He did not laugh into any ledger that night. Helen was, by the turn of the year, Miss Fletcher of Rookstone Quarry in the mouths of tradesmen from Thirsk to Richmond, and the phrase carried a weight it had not carried when the steward wrote it on the deed. On a still evening in the second spring, Helen sat on a squared block by the crane with the ledger closed on her knee and looked down at the pit that was no longer a pit but a working. The water lay low in a clean sump at the west corner, dark and useful, drawn each morning to settle dust on the tramway. 3 benches stood open in honey-colored courses to the sun. The huts had lime-washed walls and slate on the roofs and a thread of coal smoke going up from the iron grate where the kettle sat. On the deal table inside were 3 things set in a row that she looked at each evening before she blew the candle out. The japanned tin box of her mother's needles, lined in faded green baize. The small brass rule from the oak chest marked in inches for a stonecutter's work, worn smooth at the edge where a thumb had held it for 40 years. And between them the folded letter from the man who had hidden the sovereigns, whose name was Jonas Hebden, no relation to William, master cutter at Rookstone from 1802 to 1836, who had lost a daughter of 9 to lung fever and had left what he had for whoever came after and had need of it. 2 strangers who had loved children they did not live to see grown, and Mrs. Ainsley, who had lived to see it and had pressed the needles into Helen's palm and said, "Do not let them take those from you as well." The steward had signed the pit over as a jest, and the Duke had signed because the steward put it before him, and Mr. Peel had said she had paid too much for nothing. Helen counted in the ledger she did not open, £174 banked at the York Union, 31 men on her books through the season, and stone from Rookstone in the churchyard wall at Ashby's Church, in the stable gable at Nethergill, in the cloister paving at Ripon, in the lodge above Masham, and in the boundary walls of half the county. Helen Fletcher was 21 and landless, and she had £4 and 11 shillings tied into the corner of a handkerchief, and with them she took a flooded quarry no contractor would cut. It was the best £4 and 11 shillings she ever spent. If this story sat with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments where you were watching from. And ask yourself, before you close the window tonight, what thing in your own life has been called a duck pond by people who never took a hammer to it?